I'm going to try to show you a few pieces of work. In other words, not try to develop what has been the context or the text of those two books that came out, The Architecture and Disjunction and The Event Cities, but rather talk around them, and maybe I'll start immediately with the slides. You see now how this worked, if I remember. Let's see. Where are they? Good. Maybe some of you in this room remember an exhibition here, next door. Together with the Manhattan transcripts were two strange pieces of, call it furniture, artifacts, machines. What were they? They had strange chrome handles with leather bracelets attached to them. Were they steps? Were they bathtubs? Were they tables? Were they chairs? They were somewhere in between, neither quite an event, quite a program, quite an object. They were somewhere in between. 15 years later, we had a show at the Museum of Modern Art this early spring. And sorry, you can see that I was rushing and putting my slides together, but again, probably this is very interesting. Everything is suspended, everything is under tension, everything was in between. The show was very controversial, was praised, critics attacked one another on the show. One particular critic attacked the show, saying that my notion of program was misplaced, that everything had to be at its place, that the importance of program was secondary. What was important was the beauty of forms. That was the New York Times. Of course, everything that I want to discuss tonight has absolutely nothing to do with form. On the contrary, every time form happens through a conceptual manipulation, a conceptual manipulation which is easy to trace, but the form itself is an inevitable sort of, just as we have to communicate through words, there are certain formal elements that come, but they are not important. They are secondary to the concept. The primary issue is always that tension between the event or the action and that space, that, formal physical space or whatever. But there is no architecture, and you've heard me say that very often, there is no architecture without action, no architecture without program, no architecture without event. The MoMA show tried to push that to an extreme, whereby the image of the building became a sort of dematerialized, media-like superimposition, a sort of attempt to say that architecture had a form of ephemerality, since the program itself was really what was giving its definition to any of the buildings. The suspensions, the balance was all about that disjunction, that dissociation. Again, the theme, which has been a sort of leitmotif since the Manhattan transcript, that architecture is made of three elements: space, event, and movement. Those three elements have nothing to do with one another. You cannot transform a space into a movement. They don't belong exactly to the same category. They are mutually exclusive elements, and this dissociation, that disjunction between, for example, what happens in this room and the room itself, this room we could use it to play ping pong or to do a boxing game, would immediately present another type of correlation between space and event. All this seems to be very natural, very obvious, But the history of architecture has always seen it otherwise, has always wanted to see architecture as the place of certainties, the place of foundation, the place of structure. The project that I want to show you today are each questioning that foundation, that structure, that certainty. First project, the Video Glass Gallery at Groningen, where the envelope itself is entirely glass, is made of structural glass. The beams, the column is all made and held, by those clips. The envelope itself is completely neutralized, not that neutral, because of course you always bounce against a sort of series of historical precedents. The glass house of the modern movement, as you know, has been an endless fascination, but this one is very particular. If you remove the glass, you've lost the house. The glass house of the modern movement, if you take the Farnsworth house or Johnson's glass house, if you remove the glass, you still have everything the same. You have the roof, you have the steel roof, you have the steel columns. The space is defined exactly in that manner. Here, I remove the glass is structured, the glass is part of the foundation, the house disappears. Now, what is the house then? What is this space? What is the gallery? During the day, it's an interesting envelope which is slightly tipped. It goes uphill and tips to the left, and everything is relatively transparent. Dust attaches to the glass. The light is filtered through the trees, and you have a series of video monitors that project a series of tapes at the occasion of a video music festival. The simple misbalance, the fact that the building is slightly tipped already gives you question some parts of your sense of your body and gravity, but at night, suddenly something completely extraordinary happens. You do not know where you are, since your sense of orientation, finding where you are, is completely transformed by the constant bouncing of images, the video images, which reflect, of course, on the glass panels, roofs, beams, columns, and so on. Here, suddenly, the envelope becomes the media substance of the program. In other words, the envelope is secondary to the program. The Groningen Video Pavilion was important because it immediately hinted at the fact that if there was no correlation between program and envelope, there was also an incredible interdependence as soon as they were bouncing against one another. We then started to work on a house also in Holland, in The Hague, where the public and private functions of the building were exactly playing that transparency and that series of image projection on the more, let's say, public part, if there is such a thing in a house, in other words, dining room, studio, kitchen, and things like that, while the bedrooms were in the solid part of it. The attempt was to reverse some of the expectation of a house. Third project. The Lausanne bridges had one common ground with the two projects I just showed. They start with something very banal, very simple, not a formal consideration. They start with an archetype. They start with a programmatic, if you want, type. In other words, the bridge. What was the theme? The theme is in a city which is quite surrealist in a sense because of the fact that the valley that goes through it brings some topological conditions which are always fascinating for children. You enter a building on the 4th floor to come out on the ground floor. Bridges run over the houses. in some configuration which seem to be slightly hazardous. Some juxtaposition of scales, like the scale of advertising for cars passing by at 40 miles an hour, is of course not quite the scale of the pedestrian. The street in the air of Le Corbusier and the modern is there totally self-conscious. Of course, I spent about 6 or 8 years in that small city when I was a child. It made me fantasize about views of the metropolis, whereby, as you can see on the right, the bourgeoisie lived on the top of the hill, but modernism was the working class quarters downstairs, not quarters, of course, simply warehouses and industries. The theme of the bridges, of course, became our leitmotif when we developed a proposal during a sort of anonymous competition where we suggested that in order to establish a sort of life inside that area, which had become obsolete due to the fact that the warehouses and the small industries had left, and hence, of course, valuable piece of land, not unlike Covent Garden here in London, becomes a very important thing for the planners in the city as well as for landowners. And we said that the starting point had to be a form of urban generator, whereby we would take one of these types, the bridge, and turn it into a place of activities, a place of event. I think, yes. In other words, the bridge itself, the inhabited bridges, was considered a form, if you want, but form without the formal characteristic to it. It had far more to do with a conventional type that was then transformed through the addition of movements. The bridges were not anymore to cross from one side of the, or were, yes, partly to cross from one side of the valley to another, but also and mostly to go from below to above. That place where movement would happen as you would sort of go from the 0 level to level 4, level 5, was of course what was there to activate, to give that sort of energy to the actual architectural space. A number of devices were used insofar as, I think, let me see, I think I got out of sequence, and it doesn't really matter. Let me simply continue. Every time in this particular case, one of the first bridge, the bridge that we are actually designing for construction, is a railway bridge insofar as a subway station and 2 local railway lines, 2 suburban railway lines meet in that area, right in the center of the city. And there, once again, the idea was simply to take those movement trajectories, the movement of pedestrian coming out of the building, in order to out of the station, in order to determine the very logic of the building itself. No architectural preconception, but simply, oops, I think I know why I have a problem. Okay, you'll excuse me just losing slightly the track of it. Let me reverse a bit. Right. Okay. The issue of the movement becoming a form of definition of architecture had, of course, something that could be turned into a technological moment. In much of the work that we have developed over the years, much of our concern has been to try, whenever the concept was fundamental in terms of the project, let me do this, right, to try to bring that moment as the moment of technological invention. Of course, What is this all about? It's a very old story. Architecture changes at the time of the invention of large span structure, at the time of the invention of the elevator. Here, we proceeded with a sort of reversal. At the moment when architecture was changing, we were saying, let's look for a possible technological invention. In this particular case, that's just a clipping, if you want, or just a footnote. The project for the library, the main TGB, the very large library in Paris, where the jury had been quite upset when they found out that we had inserted a running track through the library, saying that the athlete of the 21st century was going to be an intellectual, or the intellectual of the 21st century going to be an athlete, and they thought that we were making fun of them. We were very serious. Not only does it exist already in certain forms in American universities, but here, of course, we were trying to turn it into a contamination of types, into a contamination, a programmatic contamination, whereby the reading, the function of reading would be altered here. But then, of course, it was fascinating to say, hey, how's about trying to make it the place where the technological invention of this building would happen? We were working a lot with, with Peter Rice at the time, who had proposed in a series of very amusing, I won't show them today, an extraordinary exchange of faxes where he proposed the first structure, which was too conservative to our taste, then proposed the current structure, and where I sent him facts of disbelief. I told him, Peter, that's never going to stand. And the issue of that box, the hollow box, became that we had started to work with at the TGB, at the very large library, was taken again for that bridge we're working on now in Lausanne, whereby the structural system becomes part of the envelope, the glass house that you recognize back from the gallery in the video gallery comes out again, this time to help the movement through in a form of trans-programming, let's see here, whereby the part of the city gets activated through those movement. Another example is the project for Kansai Airport. Kansai Airport, you know, is now completed. Renzo Piano won that competition. We got a second prize. And how did this happen? We question very much the notion of an airport as something that would be simply a place of transit. We said that an airport is a city. That airport was a mile long. That was the requirement, that place of transit. And we said if it's a linear organization of this kind, why not look at the linear city tradition and talk about a linear airport city that would go around the globe. Inside the airport, we inserted a second program, the part that you see in green, that wave. The wave was the place of urban functions with housing, with schools, with shops and galleries, museum, running tracks, shooting galleries, what have you. The main point was about saying that from a certain dimension it becomes a city. And it has nothing to do with bigness. It is about simply the insertion of a programmatic content that completely transform the nature of the beast, if you want, of that basic functional program. So it's a superimposition of program where here, as we've seen in the case of the TGB, of the very large library, it is also the place where a certain research in terms of structural consequences, again done with Peter Rice, becomes an important part of the project. Next one. Le Frais Noir. Here, nothing, no important structure, but still that notion of the program and that notion of that in between. Le Fresnoy is very much the equivalent of what we have seen in the past 5 or 7 years, that is very many so-called a competition for so-called electronic Bauhauses. The idea, the myth of the Bauhaus is still very much alive, and various countries or local government have said, we want a new Bauhaus. In the north of France, 10 minutes from Lille, in Tourcoing, the Ministry of Culture and the north region of France decided to have that center for film, movies, art, performance art, that would be combined with a place of production. In other words, experimental movie makers could go and make films with the state-of-the-art technology, a school, 400 students, sort of postgraduate degree, and of course the public would be accepted to come and view some of the rehearsal or some of the presentation. Now, the interesting thing is that, and if I juxtaposed the Bauhaus and what is or what was on the site, was that the starting point was very different. If we talked here about a school of film and performance art and painting and sculpture, it was already talking about the continuation of disciplines, saying that these could somehow merge into, in terms of giving new art form. That was the starting point. But the site, as opposed to the Bauhaus, which, as you know, was talking about a series of very precise departments, painting, sculpture, dance, Malevich somewhere, Gropius somewhere else, Schlemmer again somewhere else. No crossovers. The school at Le Fresnoy is exactly the opposite. It is about crossovers. Now, the two buildings, the starting point of those two buildings couldn't be more different. The Bauhaus was tabula rasa, was a plain field. In this particular case, they were on the site those very rotten buildings, very in unbelievably bad condition. The roof leaks were actually unsafe, and at the same time providing some quite extraordinary spaces, interior spaces, which were a series of add-ons done from the 20s to the 40s to the late 50s, and creating a sort of Pyrenean space, as for example the nave on the right extend into another nave on the left and so on. We said maybe there is something interesting about that notion of the crossover and the passage, you know, the impurity of the project. So instead of preserving it, which I'm not terribly interested in, or in terms of demolishing it, we said maybe we're going to try to do something which is say, okay, let's simply do this. Put an umbrella over it. In other words, put something that would keep the rain out, bring a whole series of, you know, contemporary technological ducts and things of this sort, and remove the issue of form and style. It did not matter whether one part of the building was an imitation of the, I call them, you know, 18th century fragments or industrial 19th century, and then bring the roof as one's 20th century thing. The formal preoccupation was totally secondary. Far more important was the relationship between the large space. In this case, of course, one falls back into a series of precedents. Mies, the collage on the left is always a fascinating one. You know it by now. It's entitled A Concert Hall. It's done in 1942, and you can distinguish in the background the Air Force bombers that were to bomb Berlin. And Mies negates that reality by superimposing simple cutouts and transform by that programmatic shift, transform the nature of the hangar. Another move is made with the three elements which are fascinating in the image on the right, the envelope, the symbolical, of course, highly charged flag, and then the crowd. In the case of Le Fresnoy, again, here I bring the parallel between the Bauhaus and what we had to deal with. Here was a multiplicity of functions, some totally contradictory, because not only did you have labs and film studios, but you also had student housing, you had live performances, you had exhibition of the most conventional type, rental spaces, bars, and the school itself, and so on. All, oops, sorry, my mistake. This, together with the existing space, which itself could not be a starting point, provided a series of what I would call undecidable spaces. The reason why I say it couldn't be provided a starting point, it was fascinating to know that those existing spaces had been used as a riding school, as a place where the wrestlers, for wrestling games, as well as the first cinema of the northern region. So we started to add around the building, to make boxes inside boxes, as you can see on the slide on the right, where two cinemas are inserted inside one of the structures, as well as the sound studios and the film studios, the school, the media library, and all these sort of things. In wood is what is old, in white is what is new, in order to develop that sort of in-between condition whereby, as you can see again, brown is what is new, is old, the wood part, translucid or white is the new part of the building. In other words, creating a sort of a very strange hybrid condition whereby, just to give you an idea of the size, the building is about 12,000 square meters, 6,000 are new, 6,000 are a reconditioning of the old one being inside that large box. This is the back of the box towards the northern part of the site where highway and an industrial canal are located. Much of the project is about that residue, that leftover space which is between the roofs, because one of the fascinating discovery with the project was you could develop something where the clash of the two parts of the concept would give you architecture without you having to design it. In other words, the space that results between the two systems of roofs becomes an absolutely fascinating place. So we looked, of course, in the history of recent history of architecture, looked at hangars and to see this type of correlation. Other examples, Friedrich Kiesler on the left, 1922, it's called RUR. It was a play that mixed theater, performance art, and cinema. On the right, the theme of things that are suspended in the air, of course, is an old fascination. This time with Moholy-Nagy, and then, of course, on the left, Lissitzky propaganda pavilion, or Kiesler, again, using the horizontal plane of that roof, of that electronic roof that we would wanted to have in that building, using the ceiling as the place of projection, but it's also the place of event. And here we've gone almost full circle. We are back where we were with the building, the little glass gallery in Groningen, where the reflection of the video projections start to activate the architecture. The architecture becomes itself thing. Then not even wanting to suggest sexual analogies between two parts of the building, but somehow much of the development of the project then became these walks or these spectacles that were taking place, exhibitions or terraces that were happening on that in between, some of the sketches during the elaboration of the project, some of the proposals. some of the working models. Once again, I think you can see on the working drawings on the left what starts to happen with that double layer. On the thing. Here I put another insert, another clip very quickly. It's a project that we are working on at the moment at Columbia University. Those of you who know the campus know that very strong Macmillan white fortress with that base that is all around, well, Broadway and Amsterdam. And you can see on the right-hand side a building that doesn't quite fit, which is a 1962 student center, which is too small. And we've been asked, which faces on one side Broadway and on the other side the old historical campus. I'll go very quickly. I'm not going to go in detail. I hope I'll have an opportunity to show it to you at another occasion. But I want to mention it simply to discuss that notion of that place, that residual space that becomes the fundamental place of the building. In other words, you see the location of the building on campus on the right-hand slide with the two white slabs, which take over an old configuration that McKim had suggested, but which has never been pursued except for Avery Hall, which doubles up the buildings on the surrounding part of the fortress. So we bring a second building in, oops, sorry, wrong button. Then we started to bring the same type of configuration with those two buildings, with the required program. I'll go very quickly on it. A huge auditorium for 1,500 students, but with the possibility of separating 400 seats for a cinema, with dining facilities and all this sort of thing. I'm not going to go into the program. It's an interesting multimedia or multi-purpose program. It has a radio station. It has publication spaces, also game rooms and various other things. But what I want you to look at is simply these yellow parts, which is the central court in that the full distribution of the building. The two buildings, the two wings of the building, the one on the left and the one on the right, are offset by 6 feet, simply because Broadway is 6 feet lower than campus. And that allowed us simply to have a continuous link between the two parts, so that, and I'll just show you those images, so that the part that faces the building is entirely transparent with light coming from behind, with those glass ramps on the facade. The facade itself has the glass ramp with the cafe tables and all that, as you can see. But inside, in the interior, a quite extraordinary space occurs, which is the place of the overspill of all the activities of the building. In other words, where you have the dining hall or the big auditorium or the cinema, or 6,000 mailboxes, which are on these ramps, they all overspill at one moment on that space, on that central space. So the space is not as no function of its own, except the one of simply being the spacing for all the, between all the different functions, but so that there, each of the activities of the building mix and contaminate, in a sense. So I'm back to Le Fresnois here with the system of galleries. I'm not going to go into this project. It will take me too long. But again, I think that was a theme for that competition in Kyoto over the railway station, a building which were half a kilometer long, with a series of very skinny towers and a whole series of disparate functions, where the framework, that sky frame, as we called it, was bringing that multiplicity of function itself. Here again, Le Fresnois with the school with these different parts. Computers are wonderful insofar as they allow you to push through the 20 or 30 or 600 different layers, if you want to, can allow you to have that multiple text, which is far more interesting than the old dialectic or opposition of 2 or 3 terms, as the history of architecture has, learned, has taught us to work with. In here, you can literally distinguish the old part, the new ones, the metal one, the wood one, and each can be a discourse of its own. And I've always found fascinating, now that everybody is using those incredible machines, that much of the logic of the autonomy of those layers was very similar to this autonomy of the early Manhattan transcript, where here the tripartite notation of the movement, the action, the runner, or the architectural configuration of that part of the city, number 2, and number 3, the directional movement. The whole Manhattan transcript was about saying that they had nothing to do with one another. They were simply clashing with one another. I spent a lot of time doing those sort of superimposition and juxtaposition. Computers do it very quickly today. These simply some of the working models. You might have seen some of these with on the beam, the main beam that supports the new roof is a place that actually takes a similar function of the support of the film images. Just a friendly hello to Kipnis here. It's not a collage, it's not a bricolage. It is simply a form of transprogramming, perhaps with small reminiscences, and I apologize for sentimentality, of the Surrealist and Lautréamont, the meeting of the umbrella and the sewing machine on the dissecting table. No hierarchies, it just happens. It's very important. Again, the history of architecture is always about order and hierarchy. Here, no, they simply play exactly a similar interchangeable role. The whole work in between, of course, a lot of things happen underneath in the same way, but I will be showing simply those logics which, as I said, play with those film images and all those catwalks in blue. But what I wanted to show you is here, which is that the lighting system of the project starts to exactly play on that notion of those autonomous, independent parts that are interchangeable. In other words, the movements in blue, the blue lines, or the vertical columns, yellow, or the place of exhibition in these green clouds, suddenly are first developed totally independently from one another, and then are simply juxtaposed whereby the result is a sort of random but totally organized, in other words, totally rational, random phenomena. Some of the views of some of the photomontage of the project. Can we have the final? Just I have a few more slides to show. Mm-hmm. Okay, while they're trying to fix the technology, the theme, again, that I'm trying to develop with you tonight has to do with, again, this leitmotif, that constant preoccupation about a definition of architecture which is always defined through the non-programmable activities that take place within it. Now, if I talk about as we are all aware of, the it's not the architect who designs the program. You can inject certain programmatic components, but those have a particular historical cycle. We all know contemporary conditions of railway stations that become museums, or of churches that become rock and roll or nightclubs. This type of other cycles are not part of the architectural control. At the same time, that juxtaposition or that play between one and the other is one that becomes absolutely crucial in terms of the reading and all the mythology that architects have given to their buildings. I would love to see Ronchamp being used as a part of the Olympics happening in Basel and Zurich. Desacralizing architecture through its use. Again, things which are on the drawing board, even things that I should not show you. This is a competition which we literally are submitting today, so it is a sort of things, like superstitious thing. I'm doing what one is not supposed to do, is to show that project for a school of architecture. Now, of all programs that I can be involved with, that was by far the hardest one. I feel very comfortable designing something for a rocket scientist or designing things for bionuclear physicists or for ecological conservationists. I know so little about all these things. However, I felt very uncomfortable about designing a school of architecture. And so that competition is actually for a building just outside Paris, in Marne-la-Vall, of all places, for 1,200 students. 3 competitors were invited, someone called Bernard Cohn, but Christian de Porzentar, the new Pritzker Prize, and us. And the reason why I'm showing it to you is, again, to make that point of that place, that interstice, that in between, that place where there's the overspill. The building, strangely enough, is really in many ways has a lot to do with the A and with Columbia. The A and Columbia couldn't be more different, as you know. The fundamental difference is that the A doesn't have studios. People don't work in the school normally. However, at Columbia, everybody is supposed to work in the school, in the big studios. The A has a fundamental place, which is that place of circulation, that hub, which is the bar and the members' room. Columbia has a staircase where people do what is absolutely forbidden in America. They smoke. They smoke and they talk. The difference between Columbia at Avery Hall and GST at Harvard is that Harvard is a perfect functional diagram, but nothing happens. While at Columbia, the place which is totally miscalculated, in other words, McKim, Mead, and White just didn't get it right. That place of the accident, that place of that strange staircase that goes through the building and cut in half by a wonderful library, but nevertheless it split the building in half, is that strange place of meeting. And as we developed our project, wrong one, let me try to go back, not miss. As we developed our project, we tried to take it as a sort of sequence. A sequence that would take you to, this time, a completely overblown, obviously maybe that's our great mistake, but overblown version of the bar, the members' room, and the staircase of Columbia. In other words, suddenly the place becomes a huge 100 meters by 25 meters a space for juries, for exhibitions, for people working, overspilling from the studios, of course bars and exhibitions and everything you want, under huge sheds surrounded by the studios and all that. Some of the simulation, some view at night, a quickie on something that of course one is not supposed to show to anyone before the jury's seen it, but they are not in London. I'll finish with very recent slides. They were taken in the last, 2 weeks ago at La Villette. And why do I bring La Villette again? It's in relationship to the theme, that theme of the spacing or that spacing that gives rise to the event themselves. You remember La Villette used to be a big industrial warehouse, not warehouse, slaughterhouse site where everything was removed, tabula rasa, then those points of activities or those points of intensities, the red follies, which in a sense was a form of deterioration, I can't say this word, whereby if the whole history of architecture in Paris had been about continuity, that project was about discontinuity. Interestingly enough, the park often is attacked for the very reason, for what we were trying to do. They say that park doesn't have a continuity of spaces. It's all sort of jumping all over the place. It's all discontinuous. It looks like an American city and not like a European city. And I always see it as a compliment. Not so much that American cities are that great, but the fact that it is perceived as what we were trying to do is this discontinuous series of points of intensity. And here some of the images. You'll recognize many of the themes I've discussed tonight with, for example, the role of, at the moment when a movement is being brought to an extreme. As you know, the project is made of a series of, the grid of points, those points of program, but then it has the lines of movements. The line of movements take all sorts of forms. They go through the gardens and so on, and then go over the bridge. Here, that's part of that garden, turns around, and with Hugh Dutton and Peter Rice, we developed that bridge that actually twists itself and becomes, that movement of, through the project. Here, as it, goes, one of the folly becomes a sort of interruption, breaks through it. Some of the views of quite an extraordinary object, and then again, hey, interesting superimposition. If I had tried to do it, I couldn't have done it myself any better. A mode of spacing that gives its place to event was superimposed in the box. I hope it will get out through a folly. Okay, and it worked upside down. Another of the new buildings. There are now 22 follies that are completed on the site. Another 3 will be completed in January, bringing it to 25, and perhaps that'll be it. That'll be it, although you never know. I always thought that we might manage to build 10 of them, and I thought that would be a major victory. At the time, people said you'll never do more than 3. And today, it's amusing. I think we feel that we've done it, but the client seems to keep asking for more. So, and I think this is my last image. Thank you very much.
We have a few moments, probably 15 minutes, and Bernard is willing to take questions if this mic is on. Let me say it again. We have a few moments, and Bernard is willing to take questions.
I wonder if it is like at Columbia this year, for some reason, I get so I play the same role as Alan, right? And I do the same thing. And I get so embarrassed because for some reason this year there are never any questions. So.
Let's certainly shut them up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just ease our way upstairs.
Okay, very good, very good. Right. Good.
Good. Is the Fresno, is it going ahead?
Yes, it's going ahead. It's under construction. It's, we have major problems with tour.
No, but Ostap does. Do you know where exactly where?